Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. I hope the day has been productive for you so far. My name is Stephen Reese. I'm the Senior Vice President of Technology for Presidio. I want to preface this with, I promise you don't want to hear me talk for the whole 50 minutes. And I preface it with that because I want to make sure this is interactive. I'm here to answer questions, to talk about things. I tend to be a little bit disruptive in my topics and ideas, so you may hear things that are wildly contrasting to maybe other topics you've heard or discussions you've heard today, and hopefully that just triggers just more of a further discussion. For those of you who don't know who Presidio is, I promise this will be the only commercial for Presidio. Presidio is a $2.4 billion provider of IT solutions across the United States. Our brand on the West Coast has was priorly known as INX. INX was acquired just over a year ago by Presidio. Presidio gave us a national footprint. We're going to talk about a lot of things that we do in the context of what we've done with other clients as it turns around cloud. We're unique in that we have about 1,200 engineers, so 50% of our staff is actually a professional services organization that think about solving business problems for our clients and driving that execution. So this will be the last, like I said, commercial about Presidio, but we'll definitely talk about some things we've done with other clients in the past. The agenda today is going to be very straightforward. We're going to talk about what is cloud, and we're going to break that down a little bit more. I know you've probably heard the what is cloud conversation 6 times today, maybe? Anybody heard it 10?
Just the last session.
Just the last session? Yeah. So any of you heard the same definition twice? Because I tend to find that in a room of 20, if I ask the definition of cloud, I get about 25 different answers. And so we're going to attempt to normalize our conversation around cloud. We're going to talk about defining cloud. We're going to talk about defining your cloud. The interesting thing about cloud is when you've seen one cloud, you've seen one. Every cloud is unique, and we need to talk about it in the context of the uniqueness of your cloud to your business, because that's the only way we really make cloud relevant. Then we're going to talk about building your cloud. And now I'm not going to give you the blocks of how we assemble it. I promise you in 50 minutes I can't do that. But we are going to talk about some framework and some phases that you go through in the context of building cloud that hopefully at least give you some guidance to take it to the next level. What you won't hear me talk about, you won't hear me talk about cloud and immediately referring to another provider. You will not hear me talk about cloud and immediately referring to something you buy from somebody else. We're going to talk about cloud the way that we really talk about cloud, is that cloud is something you provide to your business as an IT service provider to your organization. It's not something you always subscribe to. It may be, but we're going to talk about these things as we go along. So to start with the normalization and definition, cloud computing, by the way, this is the NIST definition of cloud. Cloud computing, a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access, shared pool of configurable computing resources that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort and service provider interaction. Did anywhere in there it talk about metered consumption or it living in somebody else's co-location facility? The answer is no, and we're going to talk about why in just a little bit. But I want to make sure, again, we level set on a definition of cloud. So what are the characteristics of cloud that you should be looking at? On-demand self-service. This is a little bit of an anomaly, because when we talk about self-service, it's not self-service in the context of, I want my end user to be able to stand up a server so he can do testing, right? We often see people talk about self-service that way. Self-service is really about departmental groups being able to stand up the resources or leverage the resources they need and to spin them up and spin them down accordingly, and we'll talk about that more. Broad network access. Anyone here not have to deal with brought your own device? Right, because it's not bring your own device, that stuff's here. It's not coming, we're dealing with it. We have to have broad network access, meaning I should be able to be productive wherever I live, wherever I breathe. I joke all the time that my address is Starbucks. I have 3,800 offices across the US. You could find me in any one of them at any given time. And as funny as that may seem, it's a reality. I travel for my work. Resource pooling. Shared resources. Now, this doesn't mean sharing necessarily with a business that has nothing to do with yours, and Amazon Web Services. Pooled resources is simply getting the most bang for the buck out of the money you're spending on your technology. I heard somebody earlier today say that technology was a commodity. I disagree. Equipment is the commodity. Technology is still a business enabler, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Rapid elasticity, again, the ability to grow and shrink based on demand. It doesn't say infinite elasticity, and we'll talk about that as well. And then obviously the last but not least is measured service. Why? Because the way that we measure today in organizations oftentimes is what we charge that business unit for what they use. Why? Because they're already paying subscriptions for things like Salesforce.com or Dropbox or SkyDrive or these other services. And so as an IT service provider, which is what we want you all to become, you need to have that same level of transparency to the organization as well, so they can see what they're spending their money on, so we can take IT out of being a cost center and turning IT into a value center. Any questions? This makes sense? Again, we're normalizing right now, all come into agreement on a definition. Anybody disagree with NIST on their definition? Okay, good. All right. Now, these tend to fall into three service delivery types, three main service delivery types. Software as a service, right, where you're paying for a service. This, we'll talk about it in a minute, but tends to be something you're buying in a licensed consumption model. Office 365 is an example, or Salesforce.com, where you're paying for it and that's what you're getting from it. Platform as a service. This is typically a development platform, Azure, Amazon, EC2, and there's some others out there that are doing this, and I'll give you some examples later. But it's basically taking a platform for you to be able to build your custom applications on, but it's kind of a set framework, if you will. In the olden days, we would refer to this like as the .NET platform in the IT world, in the legacy IT world. And then last but not least, infrastructure as a service. This is where you're spinning up servers, you're buying the servers, and you're building everything on top of the server. You ask for Windows, you ask for Unix, you ask for whatever it is, and then you build everything from that point forward. Now, you will hear things like desktop as a service, unified communications as a service, but they typically will fall into one of these categories if you really break them down to brass tacks. So when you start hearing all of these rumblings of everything as a service, this is really where it's kind of falling into, as one of these three categories. Now, the interesting thing about these three categories is, what is your responsibility in the legacy traditional IT management versus the service provider management model? If you look at an on-premise solution, which a lot of us have today, right? Traditional IT, if you would, you manage all of these things, right? But as you start to move up the stack, infrastructure as a service, the service provider, and again, that could be IT, but the service provider is really managing that lower end stack, the platform, if you would, where you still own the responsibility for your applications. And this tends to be something you see when you start mapping out service level agreements, right? I will map out a service level agreement that says the server will be available in an infrastructure as a service model, but if your application crashes, it's kind of your own problem, right? Because I don't own your application, I only own the platform it's living on. And then again, platform as a service, we start to add a little bit more into that service provider model. And then software as a service tends to be, again, that subscription model. You just buy it and it better be there when you need it type of a model. So I bring this here is this demonstrates an evolution that IT will have to make. As a service provider, as a cloud broker to outside resources, whatever your model ends up being, you will have to evolve your support strategy based on the type of service model you're delivering. And by the way, it's not going to be any one of these. It could be all of them that you're going to be delivering. And we'll talk about this when we start thinking about the various applications that you provide to your agencies and to your constituents as you go through in this process. Now, this is a really important thing, because one of the things that I always want to make sure we distinguish is that cloud does not mean always metered, always at a service provider, always in a public environment, and always outsourced management. It could be any one of these. Now, I'm going to pose to you probably the first of my somewhat disruptive concepts here, is consumption-based procurement. This is something that IT vendors and manufacturers are struggling with right now, quite frankly. How many of you today would say that your biggest financial barrier to building your own private cloud, or biggest barrier, I'm going to say financial, your biggest barrier to building your own private cloud is a financial barrier? You have to stand up and procure a whole bunch of equipment, right? Remember we talked about that elasticity problem? You need to be able to have enough for the just in case, knowing that invariably at most of the time you're going to be consuming 30–40% of the resources are there, but you have to buy 100%. And manufacturers today, and even resellers today, what do? They come at you and they say, well, you want to buy it or lease it? Well, what if I were to say that there are models out there and there are companies out there that allow you to do a metered consumption model for privatized equipment? So you want to build I'm going to give you an example, a hosted unified communications platform in your agency. And you want to provide that to your agency and maybe a few other agencies. And you know you have to invest X to be able to support that scalability. But what if I were to tell you that I could put that equipment in your environment as a partner, right? And there are companies out there that can do this. And what you'll do is you'll pay for a minimum spec, maybe 20%, and then when you get past 20%, you'll pay as you increment. But you'll have all the equipment already there. The reason why I say this is because the reason why most organizations refer to cloud as being something public at a service provider and outsourced is because they have the ability to do the metering. Why? Because they're gaining economies of scale. They have your agency and your agency and your agency and your agency all on shared resources, and so they can distribute that cost model. But we all know that we have assets within our agencies and within our organizations that are so critical, we need to protect them differently. We're going to talk about that when we get to governance, right? And I'll leave you with this analogy. You ever called an insurance company to insure something and they gave you a value of it? And they give you a real value, right? A baseball card is an example. If I wanted to insure a rookie year Steve Garvey baseball card, what's that worth maybe, right? $10, right? It's Steve Garvey, for crying out loud. It's not a Jackie Robinson. So the insurance company is going to charge me a premium, and if that card gets lost or stolen, they're going to give me back my $10 that card's worth. But what they don't have is they don't have the context. What they won't insure is the fact that that baseball card was the last thing that my mom gave to me before she passed away, and it has a sentimental value far and above anything that could ever be that $10. But they won't insure that. The reason why I bring that up is when we get down to start talking about some of these service providers, they're going to provide you SLAs commensurate with the reality of your data, not the context of your data. Amazon Web Services has faced how many outages in the past 6 months? I think it's 3 or 4. If you were running your entire business on Amazon, what does that mean to you? To them, it means, oh man, I'm going to have to discount their service by 20% this month. To you, it means people out of work, all kinds of different things. So we'll talk about that because the hurdle, again, for cloud is not anything more than a financial problem. It's how do you build it without having to upfront it. Okay. At Presidio, we look at cloud really and how we enable in 5 real categories. Now, these are the perspective that we take when we look at the client, right? So, end user services. This is the view the business looks at the service that you provide them. So this is not an IT discussion. This is a line of business discussion. This is the manager of X. This is the guy who says, I need BYOD, I need unified communications, I need Salesforce.com. So we have to look at how we craft a solution that addresses the needs of that person. This is very much an ROI discussion. This is very much a value discussion. Application services are how we manage and virtualize that. So this is where we start to get into the IT discussion, right? This is more about the applications. How do we keep them up, not 99.999% of the time, but 100% of the time? How do we make certain that we can ensure that level of resiliency? Continuous services. Now, this is where we start to move into the discussions around compliance. Anybody in here not have some type of a regulation that they're held accountable to, either by the government or some type of a private, like Visa or something like that? Anybody not have one? Really? I'm just kidding. There's regulation all over the place, right? So we have to ensure that continuity and information protection. So these are great discussions with those people. Compliance. in our cloud. And then the management piece. This is very much an IT discussion. How do we spin it up quickly? How do we spin it down quickly? How do we demonstrate that they're using it or not using it and charge them accordingly so that we gain the most bang for the buck? Because the reality of it is this. How many of you have heard that IT budgets are shrinking? And then the next sentence out of that person's mouth is, but technology spend is an all-time high. Okay, so if IT budgets are shrinking but technology spend is at an all-time high, where's the disconnect? The disconnect is these people that I'm talking about are going elsewhere to find their technology, or they own the budgets and they're custodying IT to be able to spend that money. They have the IT budgets now, line of business managers, etc. Well, we want to capture that back, and we're going to talk about that as well. Any questions so far on the definition of cloud? Okay, good. So let's talk about defining your cloud. So the three things that we have to focus on when defining our cloud is establishing the roles of the people who will be responsible, establishing policies for cloud, and establishing the processes for which we deploy cloud. Now this is a very important step because you will have many providers in your cloud. Okay? You will have Dropboxes. You will have Salesforce.coms. You will have the plethora of people that are downstairs in the solution center. All of them will be a part of your cloud. But what's important is that we don't compartmentalize them and treat them all differently. Because at the end of the day, you're still providing IT services to your business, right? To your agency, and we have to manage that accordingly. That's the trick. So before we ever think about bringing these people into our world, so to speak, we have to define under what context that we will allow them to participate. So the first thing we have to do is define who is the executive sponsor and the governance team. These are all roles that we play into, and we'll get to why these roles are important. How many of you have a IT steering committee in your agency today? And I'm guessing that each of you probably has a cloud initiative on your plate of some sort. Fair estimation? How many of you have, yeah, okay. How many of you have identified who the executive sponsors are, who the data stewards are, right? Who the systems stewards are, the people that are going to be responsible for making certain that you have SLAs applied not only internal but external, and that they match, and that they're commensurate with the impact of the business if there's an outage. Because what happens invariably, and we'll talk about this in just a second when we move into the policies, is if you take an email outage, people are inconvenienced, right? If you take a government application outage, people are affected significantly. The SLAs need to be different, and they need to be managed differently. And so being able to craft a team that does this, which is to define the policies around data management, application management, systems management, moving into what technologies do we allow, because believe it or not, it is not going to be the wild, wild west. It's getting there right now. The pendulum swung. Remember, IT was a command and control, right? And then this whole BYOD phenomena happened, and in the conjunction of that with all of these apps that are free out there on the market that people are using. And so what happened is people are showing up and there's applications running around your network. You had no idea that were there. And by the way, they don't comply with any level of your policy. Well, the policy that you had yesterday can't be the policy you have tomorrow. Why? Because the way you managed data yesterday is not the way you will manage data tomorrow. So we have to evolve the policies accordingly to be able to do so. Who thinks using Dropbox is a bad thing? It can be if you're putting sensitive data out there and not managing the policies. But the reality of it is, why do people use Dropbox? Because there's no alternative, right? If I don't have an alternative, what's the alternative today? FTP, right? So anybody ever try to FTP off their iPhone? Yeah, me neither. And I consider myself to be tech savvy and I can't figure it out. But the reality of it is the BYOD phenomenon has driven this concept of convenience and ease of use, even to the nth degree. But we haven't evolved our strategies to incorporate that, and most importantly, we haven't evolved the policies to allow for it. There will be a normalization that'll happen. Now, this is me future painting a picture for you. There will be a normalization that will happen where the pendulum will come back to the middle, where IT organizations, IT service providers will say, these are the list of approved application types you can use. And these are the approved vendors you can use. These are allowed. Anything else outside of this is not. But you have to be listening. As a service provider, you have to be listening to your audience and developing strategies around the Dropboxes of the world and the other applications. Because the reality of it is, someone will use Dropbox, someone will use SkyDrive, someone will use, whatever your internal strategy is. But the reality of it is, they all just want to share files. So creating a strategy and a policy and a process for them to do that starts to give them the guidance and allows you to start to wrangle that in. Now, when you establish processes from program management, the goal is to create governance, right? That's really the outcome from this all. So the top, right? Each working group will ultimately establish its own objectives and plan of action. Items referenced are just a sample. The reason why is because when you put these groups together and you create groups, I asked the question, how many of you have an IT steering committee or in the organization? How many of you invite people not in IT, end users, business managers, into your steering committees? Because oftentimes we find IT steering committees that are made up of IT, right? And what are we really solving for at that point? Because we're not really listening to the needs of the business and addressing them. So these groups will accomplish things like this, given the charter that what we're trying to do is at a high level, we're trying to reframe the way we do business. We want to become the service provider to the organization. IT does. We want to become that service provider, and we are going to become the cloud broker or cloud integrator. You've probably heard that comment a couple times today too. The reality of it is that should be your job. That's not the job of Amazon or even me. I'm here to facilitate you to be self-sufficient and transition to a cloud service delivery strategy. Does that make sense? So why is this all important? Because your cloud will be one cloud with many providers in it. Okay? Your own IT organization could be a part of this as well. But when you establish a relationship with Amazon to do infrastructure as a service, or Microsoft to do Windows Azure and platform as a service, or Office 365, or OTEC, or whoever that agency is, likely they're only going to be a component of your cloud. There's still going to be a relatively large amount of service delivery that you're going to provide from the internal IT organization, right? Why? Because liability still lands on your shoulders. The reference I always make is back to TJ Maxx, and the only reason I do it is because TJ Maxx was such a large, visible impact. If TJ Maxx had housed all of their data in Amazon Web Services and was hacked, would Amazon Web Services be responsible for that, or would TJ Maxx be responsible for that? That's right. I see everybody smiling and laughing. That's right. TJ Maxx would be responsible for it. Sure, Amazon would take a smack on the wrist probably, and there's probably some language in their contract with a TJ Maxx or somebody at that level that allows for some punitive recovery, but it's not going to be near what TJ Maxx hit. What was the hit they took on their stock? It's 100 million plus, I think, over the course of a year that they took on the stock hit as a result of that hack, right? So when you start thinking about what the true keys to your kingdom are you really going to be ready to relinquish those out to somebody else who has no accountability or is indemnifying you from that? And I hate to say it, but the truthful answer is no, it's not going to happen. So as you become a part of this cloud service provider and you start to deliver these IT services to your organization, IT is no longer going away, as you may have heard from manufacturers. Now again, why do the manufacturers say you're going to be outsourcing it to these companies? Because they don't have financial models that allow you to build and consume it up to a point. If you need 10 terabytes of storage, you're paying for 10 terabytes of storage, or you're leasing 10 terabytes of storage in 1/36 chunks. If you had a model available to you that allowed you to provision 10 terabytes of storage, but pay for the 2 that you're using, and then pay for the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th and the 6th, and when you got to 8, stand another 10 terabytes up next to it and do the same thing over again, You might be a little more open to becoming your own cloud service provider, right? And maybe these apps that you're pushing out to the rest of the world would be things you would want to take into. And these are the types of considerations you need to make. So that's why this becomes very important, is you have to recognize what is the most important asset to your organization, and are you willing to entrust it to somebody else, or do you need to own that and maintain accountability to it? Because again, when you look at this, for each type of service, there's going to be 100 different providers. If you're not providing guidance to your user community, hey, look, guys, this is the reason why we don't want you putting these files in Dropbox, right? This is the risk that it creates for us. So instead of Dropbox, here's our application that runs on your iPhone, your iPad, your Android device, your Windows device, your Macintosh computer, whatever it is. Here's your app, and here's how you use this. And by the way, we are now going to start blocking access to Dropbox because of this impact. People are more understanding and receptive to that than they are to say, don't use Dropbox. Okay? What do I use? I don't know, just don't use Dropbox. Right? Doesn't work. Doesn't work. So the reason why we talk about defining cloud in this context, I'm going to go back to this for just a second, is we as IT organizations need to be more in tune with the business. Many of us are getting there much quicker than others. I remember sitting in a meeting with the CIO of a very large fast food place. They make hamburgers. Pretty well known. They pretty much only make hamburgers. I can't say their name. But this was about, I'm going to say about 8 years ago, 9 years ago. I sat with the CIO and we were talking about strategies around making hamburgers. And he said to me, he asked the question, he says, I asked this of everybody, don't take it personally. Do you know what business I'm in? And I said, yes, I know what business you're in. He said, what? I said, you make hamburgers. My job is to get you to do it better, faster, or cheaper, right? Through the use of technology. Today, if you go through the drive-thru at said hamburger place, you'll notice that on the very busy hours, they have people walking around with tablets to take your orders. Do you know that that increases the number of cars per hour through each line of the drive-thru by 12? You know how I know that? Because I knew that business of his was making hamburgers. You have to understand the business you're in and figure out how to make it better, faster, and cheaper than it is today. And that's the new job of IT, and that's why these types of groups are so very important to the success of an IT organization. Because, I will say it again, IT budgets are getting smaller, but technology spend is at an all-time high. That means you just don't have the money, somebody else is spending it. We need to recover that so that we can build these cloud models. Any questions on, again, high level, defining the cloud? Because again, it's all about federation. It's about creating a single policy and creating access to all of these different resources underneath so that when you present service to your business, technology services to your business, it looks and feels like the same business they would see any other time. It's the IT organization being a value center. Any questions on defining the cloud? All right, so let's talk about building the cloud. There's really about 4 phases to building the cloud that we like to talk about. Cloud evaluation, cloud readiness, automated cloud platforms, and then cloud coordination. Okay, and I'll dig into these a little bit more. But here's something you need to understand in building your cloud. Consolidation is not cloud. How many of you have gone through an IT consolidation process? How many of you went through a virtualization process without going through a consolidation process? So what happens is you end up with less physical servers, but infinitely more virtual servers, right? Because you get sideways sprawl instead of upwards, downwards sprawl in the closet. Consolidation, virtualization are really 2 of the main elements to development of cloud. Now, mind you, these are internal happenings most of the time. Automation is where we really start to look at the ability to create that self-service portal we talked about, charge back and show back models, it's tools and utilities to be able to bill The human resources department on a per user basis for the training application that they've had you deploy as the IT organization. It's the ability to do that. And the of cloud is that true elasticity. Now, here's the interesting thing that happens. You're going to have public cloud offerings, if you would, software as a service offerings that are housed by somebody else. You have those today. Whether you know it or not, you do, I promise. Somebody's buying them if you're not buying them. HR's buying them, whoever's buying them. I had this discussion this morning. My IT department has no idea that I have 10 licenses of Salesforce.com that I use for a demand gen team that I have. They have no idea. It comes out of my budget, I spend it, and that's the end of it. IT probably should have some visibility to that, right? So part of the cloud initiative is getting your own affairs in order in your private cloud, the applications you need to offer, gaining an understanding of what you have in that public environment, software as a service model. And then when you start to achieve cloud, it's really marrying that all up into one presentation or one package that you present back to the business. Okay? So these steps are kind of the evolutionary steps that you go through as it relates to cloud. So, sorry, that was the only one I had built. So what are the barriers to private cloud that we just talked about, right? Inability to create truly elastic cloud, too much unpredictability of demand. How many of you know what your demand is on the last day of the quarter? Or, well, let's flip that around. California Franchise Tax Board, maybe in the room, may not, I don't know. I'm venturing to guess the demands on your systems on April 14th and April 15th are significantly higher than they are on April 16th. By an order of magnitude, right? This is not, we went from 20% to 22% demand. We went from 20% to 400% demand and back. Well, that unpredictability creates problems. When we have the ability, when we build our private cloud and create a truly transformational cloud where we're integrated into that public cloud, well, guess what? That's the hybrid cloud. So when my resources start to tax, I have the ability to transparently scale into another data center. It could be your own other data center. It could be a provider data center. Okay? Cloud consumer sources outside of IT. This is that concept of people are buying resources and you don't know about it. And it's happening. Why? Because there's this perception that IT doesn't have the capabilities, the wherewithal, the tools, the technologies. Again, I said at the very beginning, for those of you who walked in late, I tend to say things that are a little bit disruptive, that tend to be a little bit conflicting, but this is a harsh reality. So we have to go back to restoring faith into IT. And how do we do that? We bring them into the fold. There's nothing easier to turn your enemy into your friend is to bring him in and hug him and hold him next to you and stand side by side as you present the next level to your business. Cost prohibitive. Traditional vendor financial models don't line up with today's consumption models. Buy it or lease it. Those are not the only two options. And you should not be sitting on those options. If your providers are telling you that there's no way to buy in a metered consumption model as an IT organization, you need to look at it again. And you need to look around. You need to start incorporating these things into your requests. Because the reality of it is, we have to share the risk in this new world. We, the provider, the partner, and the IT organization, we have to share in the risk. And that means that we have to enable you. We know it's going to scale. We know it's going to grow. What we don't know is we don't know that it's going to happen on 1/36th increments, so we can't do it in the constructs of a lease. But we have a pretty fair estimation. History will dictate based on your organization. This is how much you're going to consume of compute resource. This is how much you're going to consume of storage, network, etc. This is a partnership. We have to be in concert with you. And part of that is us providing the visibility, or the partner providing that visibility to see that it's scaling and to be able to front end the next iteration of that technology. IT is cost of doing business philosophy. Does anybody hear that? Do you guys still hear that in your organizations? IT is a value center. The reason why we have to get out of this cost center notion is quite simply this. What's the floor of cost reduction? Zero, right? When you hit zero, you can't go any lower. And the reality of it is you'll never hit zero in cost reduction. There will always be an inherent cost. Well, zero is a finite. If we start looking at IT as a way to facilitate faster business, more business, if I can put 12 more cars through the drive-through an hour, guess what? That's an infinite amount of growth. Why? Because for every new drive-through window they add, I just added 12 more cars to that drive-through window. For every new store they add 2 more lanes, that's 24 more cars per hour. That's an infinite amount of growth. That's everybody gets excited. Now, that's true whether you're a revenue-generating operation or whether you're a service provider operation to your constituents. The more people you can serve, the happier your constituents. Same concept, yeah.
I have a question. I know that technology in the consumer world has gone up so rapidly with Apple, Google, and everybody else. The business owners are expecting a similar services in the government, and our IT models are not set up to deliver a single service that a consumer can get outside. And I think we are in a trap.
Yeah.
And we need to come out of that. So is that probably the way to provide those to?
It is. I think part of it is coming to a realization too, right? That's why I say, back a couple slides ago, I talked about some of these external providers. We need to not avoid them. We need to understand them and manage them into the business where we can and where it makes sense. Because the harsh reality is, I'll give you an example, right? Why in the world would anybody buy a phone system when I can use Skype? Why would anybody in the world buy a video system when I can use Skype, right? And it's free. Well, there are many reasons why we do things in business, and we need to have those controls. For example, if I have a video conversation with somebody, there's probably some meaningful data in that conversation, right? So if I have it, wouldn't I want to record it? And if I record it, wouldn't I want to share it? And this is where we start to think about the tactical nature of, I can do just as much with Apple, or I can do just as much with Dropbox, so I don't need this. There's a tactical thinking and a strategic thinking. Okay? IT has been in a reactive mode for a long time, and we're in that conundrum right now. And we have to get out of that world a little bit. Now, this is the hard part, right? How do you change the tires on a car going 80 miles an hour? And we don't get to stop and say, all right, reset, we're now strategic, we're now valuable to the business. We have to do is pick that landmark. So we go back to, I'm not going to back up to several slides ago, but we go back to start looking at the thing that's most impactful to your business and deal with it now. And create a strategy around it very quickly. And move into that strategy and demonstrate value to it. Because honestly, that's the only way to gain constituency, is to demonstrate true value. If Dropbox is something that you are beating your head against the wall to deal with, take a hard look at your information. Maybe Dropbox isn't so bad for you. Or maybe there's a secondary strategy. Don't think for a second companies like NetApp, EMC, HP, and others don't have quote-unquote Dropbox-style models that they're building or have already built that can be offered out there. So that's an opportunity, right? Where we can say, hey, we can't really do the Dropbox thing, but we have this solution instead. Find your noisiest people, your highest users of Dropbox, get them on your side, get them singing your praises. When they're excited about it, they become the sponsors, so to speak, to the community. And the user community is the people you have to get to. Does that make sense? I hope I answered your question. It's not a clear-cut answer, unfortunately, but you have to identify the one or two things that you can have the most significant amount of impact and transitioning with, and chase after that. Does that make sense? Other questions? I thought I saw a hand. Okay. And then lastly, difficult to manage. Departmental chargeback model, self-service provisioning. This is a very much shared model, again, with your provider partners. This shouldn't be something you feel like you have to own all by yourself. This is something where we should be in it together. Okay? The reality of the self-service provisioning, I'm going to just say this. We see a lot of talk about self-service provisioning, and at the end of the day, when we really get down to what's the business need for self-service provisioning, it's the ability for IT and maybe a handful of developers that sit outside of IT to spin up and spin down virtual machines a little bit faster. We don't have a whole lot of end users who are going, I need to build a server so I can do X. Maybe on a stretch, we've seen some self-service provisioning requirements around desktops, virtual desktops. New hire comes in, I need to be able to provision them. HR wants to be able to do it. We give them a small portal, they can provision a virtual desktop. User comes in, they blew up their desktop, they need to re-provision their desktop. But that's been about the business use case that we really see when we really peel down into self-service provisioning outside of IT. Okay, so don't get hung up on that. The departmental chargeback model, that's a biggie. Because when we can start to demonstrate to each department how much they're consuming of IT resources, two things happen. Number one is it starts to justify the investment that they're making in IT, and number two is they start to normalize their spending habits because they start to recognize where wasteful spending is occurring. People spinning things up and not using them, that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? Phone bills was the first one. When we were able to start pushing phone bills into the departments and say, here's how much you spent a month on toll-free numbers or toll charges or whatever, immediately people said, hey, stop doing that. Do this. This is our new policy. But you've got to have that visibility before you can start to course correct. So where do you start? So I talked about phase 0 is that cloud evaluation. So the place to start is quite simply this. You have to look at and understand where you are today. What applications do you have? What are necessary? What's the infrastructure? What are your users? Here's another interesting one, and I have this discussion a lot. Believe it or not, I talk way less about technology and more about business and processes and human nature and culture than anything else. User community. Do you roll out these wildly creative and new technologies to a user community, and I'm going to say it, and I hate to say it, but of 50-year-olds? Do you roll out soft phones to 50-year-old people? I'm 40, and if I'm given the choice between using my computer with a USB headset or picking up a handset and dialing a keypad, I want the phone. So you have to understand the culture of your users to understand the consumption level that they're willing to go to. That will dictate a lot, because 10 years from now, as the millennials are coming into the workforce and they're coming into being influencers of decision, right? They're not just task workers, but they're starting to move into that knowledge worker role. When they move into that knowledge worker role, that's going to evolve your infrastructure and your application requirements. It's a little less today, but it's happening today. But you have to evaluate each of your applications, what you're doing. You have to gain support from your organization. You have to. And you gain that support by bringing them into this process, those working groups that I talked about. If you're not doing that, if you at least don't have an IT steering committee, that's something you should be looking at. When you start looking at cloud readiness, this is your gap. Now your gap is starting with the things that I talked about, policies, your processes. How do you address for this service provider mentality, this elasticity model? What can I bring in? What can I outsource? What do I need to have internal? What's the keys to the kingdom? What are the things that I have regulatory compliance issues that I can't afford to allow somebody else to own? And then what are the benefits, the risks, and the costs? Look at your high-level strategy around your private, public, community, hybrid cloud models, sharing that load. Oftentimes, people outsource to companies like Amazon because they don't have the physical real estate, when in reality, there's probably a co-location strategy that could be had there to solve that same problem. So understanding what truly is the requirements, and then who are the owners and custodians of your applications, your end user community, your management, and your information protection. This is kind of phase 2. Believe it or not, a lot of people are kind of here without really doing this. That's why we list this as 0, because many people think this is phase 1, and it is, but you missed a step. And then we look at the automated cloud platform. So this is automation, the compute platform strategy. How do we do reuse? How do we do shared resource provisioning? Are we partnering with other agencies that have like interests? This concept of community cloud is one we haven't talked about today, but think about this. there are probably agencies that have similar needs and interests and regulatory compliance issues. Can you share with them? That's a strategy, right? And those are the types of things that we need to be evaluating. And then looking and coordinating with the service provider policies with your internal policy. Does it make sense for you to have an SLA that says, I will assure a priority 1 outage will be back online within 15 minutes. If your service provider's priority 1 outage SLA is 1 hour, probably not. And yet that disconnection between those two happens quite a bit. And then the last piece of it is the cloud coordination. This is where you really start to kind of bring it all together. This is bringing in the internal IT service provider resources, linking them to the public cloud resources, creating your elastic model, be that insourced or outsourced elasticity model, and creating a complete package, so to speak, of IT service delivery, much like these Rackspace and Amazons and Googles, they do, right? If you look at what they're doing, at the end of the day, they're really kind of delivering a package to you. And that's kind of the last phase of what you're doing, is taking it all, putting it into a nice, pretty package, putting a bow on it, handing it back to the business, and saying, this cloud will cost you business $873 per user per month. And I think with that, I'm hitting right up on the Q&A. I talked about a lot of topics. Again, I told you I couldn't dig down too deep in 50 minutes. But hopefully what you've garnered from this is there's a methodology here. This is not an art. It truly is a science. And the beauty of science is repeatable. We just have to make sure we follow the methodologies and the processes in place. Any questions? Comments? Anybody want to call BS? I'm okay with that too.
I have a quick question. Sorry for being late.
No.
So in this clear steps, Presidio as a company which is respected in the market, what do you do? What value can you add to this? So what's your role if public health will shake hands with you? What can you offer me?
Appreciate the question. So I'll put it this way. In its simplest form, we can advise you all the way up to what I call a golfer's edition. The golfer's edition is you turn over the keys, you go play golf, when you come back it'll all be ready. And anything in between. So what's important is when you're going through these phases, I mentioned before, many people start here and forget this. Well, we do this a lot. So this is something where if you need guidance and help, these are the types of things we can help. There's guys like Chris Murphy in the back, who's one of our engineering resources, who goes through this on a very regular basis. So any of these steps can be things that are done in concert with you. They can be done for you, and anything in between. Secondarily, I will add this. I mentioned to you before, Presidio is a $2.4 billion company. What I didn't mention is we have an exhaustively strong balance sheet. So when I talk to you about things like being able to do metered consumption in a private cloud model, where we put 10 terabytes on storage, but you pay for it as you grow, we're one of no other providers out there that I'm aware of today that's willing to put the balance sheet to work where it makes sense to do that. Because we truly believe we are in the boat with you. We're not here to pedal, we're in the boat with you. And so we're willing to share the risk where it makes sense and build a model that allows you to maintain IT inside of your own organization, because we truly believe this whole connotation of public cloud, moving everything to the public cloud, is hype. And it will stay hype for a long, long time. Because the reality of it is, it's going to be a long, long time before an Amazon or a Google or one of those guys says, you know what, if you're hacked, we're going to eat the costs, we're going to take the responsibility, and oh, by the way, we'll buy up the value of your stock for X period of time, private company, to recover your losses as a result of your brand hit, because they're not going to do that. So you have to have control of that IT asset. You have to manage it. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes?
At that point, what kind of points does Presidio or any other vendor do you see in RFP, like,
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So oftentimes when RFPs are hitting the streets to talk about consumption-based models. First of all, we don't see many of them, believe it or not, because I think even IT organizations and agencies and even in the private sector, they haven't wrapped their arms around that whole concept yet of how do we, because it has to be something measurable. I would say that the things that we're looking for in that RFP are what do you believe your measurement elements are? Is it storage? Is it compute processing power? What's the measurement element or multiples? And understanding of what your historical consumption has been. And if we don't know that, we will likely ask that in the RFP questioning. We're going to ask you, well, okay, you want to buy, you want to put enough compute capacity, platform capacity, right? The whole stack, compute, network, storage, as an example. You want to put enough in there to support the next 3 years. The first thing I'm going to say is, what's your 18-month historical scaling look like? Based on that, that's going to help us to be able to start to craft that. Does that make sense? Other questions? I got about half a minute left. He's throwing the sign at me and I'm getting the hook next. If you do have other questions, I've got some time. I'll be up here. I will also be back around this evening, and there are several other individuals from Presidio that are here. So again, we're here to answer questions. If you want to follow up with me, I have business cards as well. I'd be happy to follow up with you individually as well. With that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.